I thought I'd never feel close to anyone again after Daniel, but grief has a way of surprising you, pushing you into moments that feel raw, tender, and so achingly human. When I opened myself to love again, it wasn't just physical. It was rediscovering the parts of me I thought I'd lost. This is my story of finding connection, even when I didn't think I deserved it. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't for a long time. Every room was filled with echoes of what used to be. Laughter that had faded into silence, warmth replaced by an unshakable chill. I sat on the edge of the couch, a steaming mug of tea cupped in my hands. The television played some late-night show I wasn't paying attention to, its muted light flickering across the walls. The stillness of the room pressed down on me, heavier than the blankets I'd piled on my lap. It had been 2 years since Daniel passed, but the grief lingered, stubborn and suffocating. I thought time was supposed to heal wounds, but it felt like mine had only festered. Friends had been supportive in the beginning, dropping off casseroles and checking in with calls. But eventually, life moved on for them as it should. I stayed here, stuck in this house filled with memories and shadows. The mornings were the hardest. Waking up to an empty bed. The weight of Daniel's absence hitting me before I even opened my eyes. It was a routine I wouldn't wish on anyone. His favorite mug still sat in the cupboard. The handle chipped from the time he dropped it while laughing too hard at one of my jokes. I hadn't touched it. Couldn't bear to. I tried everything to feel normal again. Therapy sessions once a week. Meditation apps that promise peace, even joining a book club for a few months. Nothing stuck. The silence was unrelenting, and the loneliness felt insurmountable. I would sit by the window for hours, watching the world go by and wondering how people kept moving forward while I was frozen in place. That night, as I stared blankly at the television, something inside me cracked. The realization hit me like a wave, unexpected but undeniable. I couldn't keep living like this. The house, the solitude, the endless weight of grief, it was swallowing me whole. I set the mug down and pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, as if I could push the tears back in. I can't do this anymore, I whispered to the empty room. The words lingered in the air. Fragile but powerful. I didn't know what I meant by them, not yet. But the next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, an idea formed. Started as a flicker. A passing thought, but it quickly grew, taking root in the quiet corners of my mind. A dog. Daniel had always loved animals. He used to talk about getting a dog someday. Something scruffy and full of personality. I wasn't sure why the idea felt right now, but it did. Maybe it was the thought of another presence in the house. Something alive and warm to break the suffocating quiet. Or maybe it was a way to feel closer to him, to honor a piece of his dream that had never been realized. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I knew I needed something, anything, to pull me out of this void. I picked up my phone and typed local animal shelters into the search bar. The first result was a small rescue center just a few miles away. They had a website with pictures of adoptable dogs, each one accompanied by a brief description. My finger hovered over the screen as I scrolled through the faces. Some were playful, others timid. All of them seemed to be waiting just like me. My breath hitched as I clicked on the contact form. I didn't know what I was looking for, but maybe this was a start. The shelter was smaller than I'd expected. Its entrance was tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat, with a handwritten sign that read, Open Hearts Animal Rescue. The smell hit me as soon as I walked in, antiseptic mixed with wet fur. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was sharp and unfamiliar. A cheerful woman behind the desk looked up and greeted me with a smile. Hi there. Looking to adopt? She asked, her voice warm. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I think so. Her smile widened. Great. We've got plenty of dogs looking for homes. Big ones. Small ones, whatever you're looking for. She gestured for me to follow her, and we stepped through a doorway into a long hallway lined with kennels. The noise was overwhelming. Barking, whining. The occasional deep growl. It all blended into a chaotic symphony. I tried to focus, scanning the kennels as we walked. Dogs of every size and color rushed to the front, their tails wagging furiously, their eyes pleading for attention. Some jumped and barked, Others tilted their heads or pressed themselves against the bars. But none of them felt right. We reached the end of the hallway, and I was beginning to feel disheartened. Maybe this had been a mistake. Then I saw him. He was sitting at the back of his kennel, away from the noise and commotion. His shaggy fur was a patchwork of gray and brown, with white streaks on his chest and paws. His eyes were what caught me, dark and deep. They seemed to hold something beyond what I'd expect from a dog. Something calm, almost knowing. Unlike the others, he didn't bark or jump. He just watched me. "That's Rex," the woman said, noticing my pause. "He's a bit of a mystery. We don't know much about his background. He was found wandering a few months ago, no collar or microchip. He's been quiet since he got here. But he's a sweetheart." "Rex," I murmured, crouching down in front of the kennel. The name felt strange on my tongue, but it suited him. "Hi there." He tilted his head slightly, a small movement that sent a pang through my chest. I extended my hand through the bars, and after a moment's hesitation, he stood and approached me. His movements were slow, deliberate. He sniffed my hand, then pressed his nose against it. It was a brief, tentative connection, but it was enough. "I think he likes you," the woman said, her voice tinged with excitement. I smiled faintly. "Can I spend some time with him?" "Of course. Let me get him out for you." She opened the kennel, and Rex stepped out cautiously. He wasn't nervous exactly, just calm and measured. She handed me a leash, and I led him to a small outdoor yard behind the building. The space was fenced in with patches of grass and a few scattered toys. Rex stayed close to me, his fur brushing against my leg as we walked. I sat down on a bench and he climbed up beside me, resting his head on my lap. The weight of him was grounding, and I found myself running my fingers through his fur without thinking. It was soft but slightly unkempt, with a wildness that suited him. "You're not what I expected," I whispered. "But maybe that's a good thing." Rex tilted his head again, his eyes meeting mine with that same steady intensity. It was almost unnerving how much he seemed to understand. When I returned to the lobby, the decision had already been made. The adoption paperwork felt like a blur. I signed my name, paid the fees, and listened to the woman's advice about food and care. By the time I left the shelter, Rex was sitting in the passenger seat of my car, his dark eyes scanning the world outside with quiet curiosity. As I drove home, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He sat perfectly still, his head slightly tilted as though processing everything he saw. I reached over and rested my hand on his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Welcome home, Rex," I said softly. He didn't wag his tail or bark. He just turned his head toward me, his gaze steady and unblinking as if to say, "I know." The house felt different with Rex in it. Not completely, but enough to notice. His presence was quiet but undeniable, filling the space in a way that had been missing for so long. I watched him as he explored, his movements deliberate and calm. He sniffed at the corners of the living room, paused to inspect the kitchen, and finally settled near the window, where a patch of sunlight spilled across the floor. It wasn't immediate, but slowly, the silence in the house began to lift. Rex wasn't a loud dog, he rarely barked and never whined, but his soft footsteps and occasional sighs brought life back to the space. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed having someone, or something around to share it with. Our days quickly settled into a routine. In the mornings, I'd find him waiting by the bedroom door, his dark eyes watching me with quiet patience. After letting him into the yard, I'd sip my coffee by the window and watch him sniff around the bushes or chase the occasional bird. Breakfast was simple: toast for me, kibble for him, and then we'd take a walk around the neighborhood. Those walks became my favorite part of the day. Rex stayed close to my side, his leash slack, his head turning occasionally to take in the sights. He wasn't the type to tug or dart after every squirrel. He seemed content just to be near me, as if the act of walking together was enough. Evenings were quieter. I'd read on the couch while Rex lay at my feet, his body warm against mine. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me, his gaze steady and unblinking. It wasn't unsettling, at least. Not yet. It felt more like he was trying to figure me out, to learn the rhythm of my life. One night, as I sat in the living room with a book in my lap, Rex climbed onto the couch beside me. He rested his head on my knee, and I let my hand drift to his fur. It was soft and warm, and I found myself absently stroking it as my mind wandered. "Thank you," I murmured, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for. Rex didn't move, but his tail thumped softly against the cushions, a small reassuring gesture that made the house feel just a little less lonely. Rex had become a constant in my life, a quiet shadow that never strayed far. Days turned into weeks, and our bond deepened in ways I hadn't expected. He wasn't just a dog to me anymore. He was my confidant, my silent partner in the slow process of moving forward. At first, it was the little things that drew me closer to him. The way he seemed to know when I was upset, pressing his warm nose into my palm as if to say, "I'm here." Or the way he followed me from room to room, never demanding attention but always present, a comforting weight in a house that had felt so empty. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the living room window, I found myself talking to him. I was sitting on the couch, my legs curled beneath me while Rex lay on the floor nearby. "You know," I began, my voice soft, "Daniel always said we'd get a dog someday. He wanted someone scruffy like you." Rex lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting mine, and for a moment I felt like he understood. It became a habit talking to Rex. I told him about Daniel, about the things I missed and the things that still hurt. I told him about the little joys I was rediscovering, like the way the morning light hit the kitchen counter or the sound of birds outside the window. He listened without judgment, his tail wagging softly whenever I paused. It was easy to forget, in those moments, that he wasn't human. But there were times when his behavior unsettled me. He always seemed to know where I was, even when I thought I was alone. If I turned a corner too quickly, I'd find him already there, his dark eyes watching me with a steady gaze that felt almost too perceptive. It wasn't intrusive, not at first. It felt protective, like he was keeping an unspoken promise to stay by my side. One night, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Rex climbed up beside me and rested his head on my lap. The air was cool, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. I ran my fingers through his fur, my thoughts drifting. "You're good for me, you know that?" I whispered. His tail thumped against the wooden planks, a small but reassuring response. But as comforting as Rex was, there were moments that gave me pause. Like the time I dropped a plate in the kitchen. The ceramic shattered against the tile floor, the sound sharp and jarring. Rex didn't flinch. He walked over slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, and sat beside me as I crouched to pick up the pieces. His presence was steadying, but the way he watched me, it was almost as if he understood the frustration and sadness that had bubbled up in me. Then there were the nights when I'd wake up to find him sitting at the foot of my bed, his gaze fixed on me. It wasn't unnerving exactly, but it was strange. He wasn't looking for attention or comfort. He was just watching. I told myself it was normal, that he was just a dog being a dog. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind. One afternoon, as I sorted through a box of Daniel's belongings, Rex sat nearby, his head resting on his paws. I pulled out an old scarf Daniel used to wear, the fabric soft and worn from years of use. As I held it up, Rex's ears perked up and he stood, his tail wagging gently. I froze, the scarf dangling from my hand. "Do you recognize this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It was a ridiculous question, of course he didn't. But the way he looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name, made me wonder. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the unease crept back in. Rex was lying at the foot of the bed, his body stretched out but his eyes open. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Was I imagining things? Was I projecting my emotions onto him? Or was there something about Rex that I didn't understand? As the days went on, his presence became both a comfort and a puzzle. He was always there, always watching, always knowing. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just a dog. Not entirely. But the thought was too absurd to entertain for long. Pushed it aside, telling myself that grief had a way of warping reality, of making us see things that weren't really there. And yet, late at night, when the house was quiet and the shadows stretched long across the walls, I couldn't help but wonder, what if I'm wrong? It started with small things, the kind of details that are easy to dismiss at first. Rex would appear at the doorway just as I was thinking of him, or he'd shift his attention toward me right before I spoke his name. It felt like coincidence, but the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, I was reading on the couch while Rex lay sprawled at my feet. The living room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a table lamp. My mind wandered from the book in my hands, and I found myself staring at the framed photograph of Daniel on the shelf. Without meaning to, I let out a sigh, a long heavy sound filled with the weight of memory. Rex lifted his head instantly. His dark eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I froze. It wasn't just that he'd noticed me. It was the way he looked at me, as though he knew exactly what I was feeling. It wasn't the first time I'd seen that look, but it felt sharper now, more intentional. I set the book down and ran a hand through my hair, breaking the gaze. "You're a good listener," I muttered, trying to brush off the feeling. But his eyes didn't waver. The next morning, I woke to find him sitting at the foot of my bed. His posture was perfect, his head tilted slightly, and his gaze unrelenting. "Rex?" I asked, my voice groggy with sleep. He didn't respond, of course, but the weight of his stare was enough to make me sit up. "You're up early." I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, expecting him to follow me as he always did. But he stayed where he was, his dark eyes tracking my every move. It wasn't until I left the room that he rose and padded after me, his steps silent on the hardwood floor. The feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. No matter where I was in the house, Rex was there, his presence steady and unyielding. He never demanded attention, never barked or whined. He simply observed, his gaze a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the bedroom, I felt a prickle of awareness at the back of my neck. I turned quickly, expecting to see Rex in the doorway. Instead, I found him already inside the room, sitting by the window. He wasn't looking outside, though. He was looking at me. "You're always watching, aren't you?" I said, half joking, but the sound of my own voice felt hollow. Rex tilted his head, the motion so deliberate it sent a shiver down my spine. I laughed nervously and turned back to the laundry, but the feeling stayed with me. The breaking point came later that evening. I was in the kitchen making tea, when the mug slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor. The sound was deafening in the quiet house, and I froze, staring at the shards scattered across the tile. Rex appeared in the doorway within seconds, his movements unhurried but precise. "I'm fine," I said, my voice shaky. But he didn't move. He stood there, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. It wasn't just concern, it was something deeper, something I couldn't name. Slowly, he walked into the kitchen, his paws silent against the floor. He stopped a few feet away from me, his head tilted as though assessing the situation. I crouched to gather the pieces of the mug, but my hands trembled too much to hold them steady. Rex stepped closer, his nose brushing against my arm, and I dropped the shards with a gasp. "Rex, no," I said, trying to push him back. But he didn't move. His dark eyes bore into mine, and for a moment, it felt like he was trying to tell me something. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, and he followed, his movements deliberate and unrelenting. I escaped to the bedroom, closing the door behind me and leaning against it for support. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. "He's just a dog," I whispered to myself, repeating the words like a mantra. "He's just a dog." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The way he looked at me, the way he moved, it was too calculated, too knowing. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. A few minutes later, I heard the soft sound of paws against the floor. Then came the scratching at the door, faint but insistent. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. The sound burrowed into my mind, amplifying the unease that had been building for weeks. When I finally opened the door, Rex was sitting there, his posture calm and composed. His eyes met mine, and in that moment I felt like I was the one being studied, the one under scrutiny. I backed away slowly, and he stepped forward, his movements measured and deliberate. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. But of course he didn't answer. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his gaze on me, a silent presence in the darkness. And when I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, echoes of questions I wasn't ready to face. I woke the next morning with a knot of unease sitting heavy in my chest. The events of the night before replayed in my mind, each moment sharper and more disconcerting than the last. Rex had been quiet since sunrise, curled up by the front door as if guarding it. But his silence didn't bring peace. It felt like a weight, pressing against the walls of the house. I needed answers, or at least clarity. I decided to bring it up in my next therapy session, something I had avoided doing until now. By mid-afternoon, I was sitting across from my therapist, the familiar office feeling oddly foreign. The smell of lavender lingered in the air, and the soft ticking of a clock filled the silence between us. A woman in her late 40s to early 50s. My therapist had a heart-shaped face with soft hazel eyes behind thin-framed glasses. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was neatly styled in gentle waves. She sat with her hands lightly resting in her lap, her warm beige skin reflecting years of empathy and careful listening. Her maroon blouse and beige cardigan gave her a relaxed but professional demeanor that made it easier to open up. I don't know how to explain it. I began, my voice faltering. Rex has been different. It's not just that he's always there. It's the way he looks at me like he knows something I don't. My therapist tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but curious. Dogs are incredibly intuitive, she said gently. They pick up on our emotions, our routines. It sounds like Rex has become very attuned to you. I nodded but hesitated. It's more than that. He doesn't just react, he anticipates. It's like he's watching my every move, waiting for something. She didn't dismiss me, which was a relief. Grief can heighten our perception of things, she said. You've been through so much, and it's possible you're projecting some of your emotions onto Rex. That's not uncommon. Pets often become mirrors for what we're feeling. I left the session feeling slightly lighter but no less conflicted. Her words made sense, but they didn't explain everything. The way Rex moved, the intensity of his gaze, it was too precise, too deliberate to be mere intuition. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found Rex sitting in the living room, his head resting on his paws. The golden light cast long shadows across the floor, stretching toward him like fingers. He looked up when I entered, his dark eyes meeting mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. I crossed the room slowly and sat on the couch, my heart pounding in my chest. Rex, I said softly, what are you trying to tell me? He tilted his head. The gesture so familiar it sent a chill down my spine. I reached out hesitantly, my hand hovering just above his head. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. His gaze stayed locked on mine, steady and unyielding. You're not just a dog, are you? The words escaped before I could stop them. They hung in the air, absurd and heavy but somehow true. Rex didn't respond, of course. But the silence that followed felt louder than any bark could have been. I pulled my hand back and stood abruptly, the need to escape overwhelming. I need some air, I muttered, grabbing my coat from the hook by the door. Rex didn't follow me this time. He stayed where he was, watching as I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The night air was crisp, the stars faint against the glow of distant streetlights. I took a deep breath, letting the cold fill my lungs. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could think clearly. But even as I stood there, the feeling of being watched lingered. It wasn't just Rex, it was something deeper, something I couldn't name. When I returned to the house, Rex was waiting by the door. His posture was calm, his tail wagging faintly as I stepped inside. But his eyes, they hadn't changed. They were still dark, still intense, still filled with that unspoken something that I couldn't shake. I crouched down in front of him, my hands resting on his fur. You're not just a dog, I whispered again, my voice trembling. I don't know what you are, but I know you're not just a dog. Rex leaned into my touch, his nose brushing against my arm. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like a confirmation of something I wasn't ready to accept. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled web of fear and curiosity. Whatever Rex was, whoever he was, I needed to understand. I needed to know. I woke to the sound of scratching, faint but persistent, It crept into my dreams and pulled me into consciousness. The room was dark, the faint blue glow of the moon spilling through the curtains. My heart pounded as I sat up, listening. The scratching came again, this time from the direction of the door. "Rex!" I called, my voice a trembling whisper. The scratching stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, hesitating for a moment before walking to the door. When I opened it, Rex was sitting there, his posture calm and deliberate. His dark eyes met mine, and the weight of his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. "What is it?" I asked, my voice unsteady. Rex didn't move. He just sat there, his head tilted slightly, as if waiting for me to understand something I couldn't grasp. I knelt down, reaching out to touch him, but he shifted back, his movements slow and precise. "Rex!" My voice faltered. The air between us felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I backed away, closing the door softly, and sat on the edge of the bed. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. What was happening? What had I brought into my home? The next day, the tension between us was palpable. Rex followed me from room to room as he always did, but his presence felt different now. It wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Every glance, every movement, carried a deliberate intensity that made my skin crawl. By evening, I was at my breaking point. I sat in the living room, the TV on but muted, the flickering images casting shadows across the walls. Rex sat in the doorway, his eyes fixed on me with an unrelenting stare. I couldn't take it anymore. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice rising with desperation. "Why are you doing this?" Rex tilted his head, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. He stood slowly and walked into the room, his movements deliberate and silent. He stopped a few feet away from me, his gaze never wavering. "Stop it!" I shouted, standing abruptly. My hands trembled as I pointed toward the hallway. "Go! Leave me alone!" But Rex didn't move. He just stood there, his body still, his eyes locked on mine. The intensity of his stare felt like a weight pressing down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. I backed away, my heart racing, and stumbled into the kitchen. The light above the sink flickered as I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breathing. Moments later, I heard the soft sound of paws on the tile. I turned to find Rex standing in the doorway, his posture calm, his gaze unrelenting. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, tears spilling down my cheeks. "What are you?" Rex stepped forward, his movements slow but purposeful. He stopped just inches from me, his dark eyes boring into mine. I felt frozen, trapped in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. "I can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. I pushed past him, grabbing my coat and keys from the hook by the door. "I need to get out of here." Rex didn't follow me this time. He stayed in the kitchen, watching as I opened the front door and stepped into the cool night air. The relief was immediate but short-lived. Even outside, the weight of his gaze lingered, an invisible presence that I couldn't shake. I drove aimlessly for hours, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. My thoughts raced, a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and guilt. I couldn't go back, not yet. I wasn't ready to face whatever Rex was, whatever he represented. When I finally returned, the house was eerily silent. I stepped inside cautiously, half expecting to find Rex waiting by the door. But he wasn't there. I walked through the house, each step echoing in the stillness, until I found him in the living room. He was sitting in the same spot he had been earlier, his posture calm, his eyes fixed on me. For a moment we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. "I don't understand you," I said, my voice trembling. "But I need you to stop." Rex didn't move. He didn't blink. He just watched. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time since bringing him home. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Whatever was happening between us, it was building to something, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was. The morning light filtered weakly through the blinds, casting faint stripes across the walls. I hadn't slept. The night had passed in restless silence, my thoughts a whirlwind of fear and indecision. Rex had stayed outside my door, his quiet presence a reminder that I couldn't escape what was happening. Not truly. But I had to try. I dressed quickly, grabbing a duffel bag from the closet and stuffing it with essentials. My hands shook as I worked, the sound of zippers and rustling fabric filling the otherwise quiet room. I couldn't stay here. The house, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. And Rex was the lock I couldn't open. When I opened the bedroom door, he was waiting. His dark eyes met mine, calm but piercing, and for a moment, I froze. He didn't move, didn't bark or wag his tail. He just stood there watching me. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking, "but I can't do this anymore." I stepped around him carefully, the bag heavy on my shoulder, and made my way to the front door. Rex followed, his movements slow and deliberate. When I turned to face him, he sat down, his posture steady and composed. His gaze was unrelenting, filled with something I couldn't name. "This isn't goodbye," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "I just need time." Rex tilted his head slightly, the gesture so familiar it sent a pang through my chest. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cool morning air biting against my skin. The street was quiet, the faint sound of birdsong breaking the stillness. I hesitated, glancing back one last time. Rex stood in the doorway, his dark fur catching the soft light of dawn. His eyes stayed locked on mine, unblinking, as though he were memorizing the moment. My throat tightened and I turned away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze any longer. The car felt suffocating as I slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine and pulled away, the house disappearing in the rearview mirror. Each mile put more distance between us, but it didn't ease the tension in my chest. Even as the streets turned into highways, I couldn't shake the feeling that Rex's presence lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I drove aimlessly, the bag sitting heavy in the passenger seat. The world outside blurred, the passing scenery meaningless as my thoughts spiraled. What was I running from? A dog? Myself? The questions felt absurd. But they gnawed at me, refusing to be ignored. When I finally stopped, it was at a small roadside motel. The building was unremarkable, its faded sign flickering in the early morning light. I checked in quickly, avoiding eye contact with the clerk, and found myself in a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale air. The bed was stiff, the walls a dull beige. I sat on the edge, the bag forgotten on the floor, and buried my face in my hands. The weight of everything, Daniel's death, my grief, Rex, crashed down on me all at once. I didn't know how to move forward, but I knew I couldn't go back. Not yet. The hours passed in a haze. I stared at the ceiling, at the cracked paint and flickering light, my mind replaying every moment with Rex. His eyes, his movements, the way he always seemed to know, none of it made sense. And yet, it felt undeniable. By evening, the knot in my chest had loosened slightly. The distance from the house, from Rex, brought a faint clarity, but the questions remained, haunting the edges of my thoughts. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. All I knew was that, for now, I needed space to breathe, to think, to find a way to understand the bond that had grown between us, and what it truly meant. The motel room was quiet, the kind of silence that should have been soothing but wasn't. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, staring at the duffel bag I'd tossed in the corner hours ago. The curtains were drawn, and the faint hum of the air conditioning filled the space, masking the restless thoughts swirling in my mind. I'd left the house. I'd left Rex. But the weight of him still lingered, as if I'd brought him with me somehow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his dark, unyielding gaze. It wasn't angry or pleading, just watchful, patient. It was that patience that unnerved me most of all. My phone buzzed softly on the nightstand, breaking the stillness. A text from a friend I hadn't spoken to in months, asking how I was doing. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, but I couldn't find the words to respond. How could I explain the chaos of the past few weeks? The way Rex had filled the void in my life, only to become a question I couldn't answer? Instead, I set the phone down and leaned back against the headboard, closing my eyes. Memories of Daniel surfaced, unbidden but familiar. His laughter, his touch, the way he'd always known what to say when I felt lost. Losing him had torn a hole in my life, and for so long, I tried to fill it with silence. Then Rex came along, and the silence had shifted into something else entirely. The truth was hard to face, but it was there, staring me down like Rex had in the kitchen. I wanted him to be more than just a dog. I'd needed him to be. I'd poured all my grief, my hope, my fear into him, until he became something bigger than himself, a mirror for everything I couldn't confront. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I let them fall, the release cathartic in its simplicity. I'd left because I was afraid, not of Rex but of what he represented, of the way he forced me to see myself, my grief, my loss. But running hadn't solved anything. Never did. By the time the tears stopped, the room felt lighter, the air less oppressive. I didn't know if I was ready to go back, but I knew I couldn't keep running. Rex had been more than a dog to me, but he'd also been a catalyst, a push toward facing the things I'd tried so hard to bury. I picked up my phone and opened the photo gallery, scrolling until I found a picture of Rex lying on the porch, the sunlight catching the silver in his fur. His eyes, even in the stillness of the image, seemed to look straight through me. A faint smile tugged at my lips. "Thank you," I whispered. The words barely audible but heavy with meaning. Tomorrow was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while it felt like mine to shape. Rex had shown me that much.